short, medium, long-range missiles that are aimed at the United States and the region and our allies, and of course their nuclear goals, which have been clearly stated that they would not yield on. And so President Trump engaged in an earnest diplomatic effort to try to come to some resolution. The Iranians, in typical fashion, this regime has decided, nope, they're not going to take a diplomatic route, and this is the consequence of it. This is the first time a president, outside of President Reagan, because President Reagan almost demolished their Navy in 1988 in response to their attack on the Samuel B. Morris. He was the last president that had the fortitude to take on the Iranians in any measurable way. So I'm comfortable that this had to happen.
Congressman Crawford, we appreciate your time and your perspective. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Let's go ahead and bring in ABC's senior political correspondent, Rachel Scott, here in New York, tracking all of this as well. Rachel, I know that you've been in touch with the White House, the Trump administration. What more are you learning about how they are monitoring all of this and perhaps what we could see in the coming hours and days?
Well, we are hearing more right now from the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. She says that the president continues to monitor the situation from his Mar-a-Lago estate down in Florida. She also says that he did speak with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the phone. She also confirmed a little bit of what you heard there from Congressman Crawford, saying that Secretary Rubio called all members of the Gang of Eight, again, that's the top Democrats and Republicans in Congress, to let them know that the administration was in fact moving forward with this operation. And then she continues to insist that the president will monitor this throughout the day. Again, right now, we are not expecting to see the president as he's down in Mar-a-Lago. Of course, we will notify everyone if that changes. But I think it was really interesting there what Crawford was saying when it comes to the questions that you were asking him on whether or not Republicans are going to be comfortable with what the president said, this possibility that American lives can be lost. We know from my sources that this played out just over this past week in two separate briefings where the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, did brief members of Congress behind closed doors in that classified briefing. Multiple sources tell me that at that point, Rubio told lawmakers that the president had not yet made a decision. And one of the big open-ended questions was whether or not this was going to be a joint military operation with Israel. Then I am told yesterday that is when Secretary Rubio started to make the calls. We are told that he did reach 7 out of the 8 top congressional leaders. But again, just because these congressional leaders got a heads up, that does not necessarily mean that they approve of this operation. In fact, we are hearing from a growing number of Democrats this morning who are insisting that President Trump and the Trump administration need to get congressional approval before they move forward with a widespread military operation like this. Right now, House Democrats are trying to organize a call for this weekend to figure out how they're going to move forward. But we are already hearing from Democrats who are demanding that a bill be put on the floor in both the House and the Senate, a war powers resolution to essentially serve as a check to President Trump in military action in Iran with.
Rachel Scott for us. Yeah, and as you've noted, too, it's also some Republicans who've expressed some strong frustration and condemnation for what has happened here. We're tracking all of it. Rachel, thank you. And let's bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Pierre, it's good to have you because obviously when something like this happens, there's also what about the domestic threat here at home and what are not only Iran's capabilities for how they could potentially harm Americans, but of course the fear of a lone wolf, somebody acting out inspired by what's happened in the Middle East.
Well, we're in uncharted territory here because if it's true that the Iranian leadership and also not only the military is being affected and impacted by this, their need or desire to have restraint may be now thrown out the window. We have information that the FBI director has ordered his counterterrorism and counterintelligence operatives and agents in the United States to be at an elevated alert. We've been talking to sources throughout the morning, and we also expect to see stepped up security in some large cities, New York City, for example, perhaps Los Angeles. DC police here say they're monitoring the situation and may expand resources as needed. So what all this means is that people are aware that Iran has shown some capabilities or desire to execute operations in the United States. They've attempted to assassinate political figures here, dissidents here. There was even a plot targeting President Trump that they were engaged in. So there's real concern about those things. Also, the more imminent threat people have talked about is the notion of cyber attacks. Iran trying to target United States infrastructure. And as you mentioned, Whit, lone wolves, people acting out in response to all the devastation and the tensions that they see overseas. That's a real potential here as well.
Yeah, no doubt a time of heightened alert. Pierre-Thomas Forrest, thank you. Let's go to ABC's Marcus Moore now, who's in Doha, Qatar. And Marcus, where you are, that's one of the countries that has been dealing with these retaliatory strikes. We were on the air earlier this morning, and you were hearing those sirens and what sounded like intercepting missiles, right, with incoming fire from Iran.
Yeah, that's right, Whit. And this was something that went on for quite a while, well into the night here in Doha. The sounds of these loud booms echoing across the city here, giving you a sense of really how volatile this situation is and how the entire region is impacted. As I talk to you now, we are learning about reports of a drone that has struck the airport in Kuwait. I think we have some pictures from that scene where, according to a spokesperson with the civil aviation ministry there, that there have been a number of injuries among workers at the airport and that there was some damage, some partial damage to a terminal there. We understand from officials in Kuwait that the situation is now under control, but Whit, that is just another country that has been in the midst of the retaliation, and many people worry that this could spiral out of control.
And major U.S. military assets in Qatar and all throughout the region, too. We've seen some half-dozen countries that have faced some retaliatory strikes. Marcus Moore for us, thank you. Please stand by. Let's go ahead and check back in with ABC's chief foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, joining us from Tel Aviv. And Ian, I know you're still in that air raid shelter there. But I also just want to ask you about Iran, because I know you've covered this region for such a long time. This is a country that really doesn't have that many friends anymore. I mean, the Assad regime in Syria was one of their big allies. Their proxy groups in Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, all weakened in recent months and years. But it raises the question of how they will respond if their backs are against the wall.
Yes, if they think it's an existential crisis, and when you start talking about regime change, that's exactly what it is for Iran. I think that partly explains these kind of large-scale retaliatory strikes that we're seeing across the Gulf now. So many countries that Marcus was referring to there, which are U.S. allies, also home to U.S. troops and military bases. I think for the Iranians, this is fight or die moment. I think the regime knows its back is totally against the wall, and because the Iranian leadership is being targeted. You're right, it doesn't have many friends left in the region. If you go back to before October the 7th, 2023, we used to talk about the Shia crescents. These are countries with majority Shia Muslims who were supportive of or allied to Iran. And the crescent essentially ran from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, into Lebanon. Well, in Lebanon, you've had Hezbollah, which has been significantly weakened. Interestingly, they've released a statement about the attacks on Iran, which, while condemning what the US has done, doesn't seem to indicate that they're ready to come out and start attacking Israel in support, which has been one of the fears here. In Syria, you have Bashar al-Assad, who's been removed from power. You now have a new government that is friendly to the United States. In Iraq, you still have these popular mobilization units. These are militias, which many of whom are backed by Iran. They almost act as a paramilitary force, independent of the government. They have said an attack on Iran would lead to retaliation against US forces in the region, and we've seen those groups do that before. So that will be one particular danger to look out for. But otherwise, you know, the strength of this resistance movement that existed throughout this region has been substantially weakened. But I also want to remind everyone, we're in the holy month of Ramadan, and going after Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, probably the second most important figure in Shia Islam, will have a huge impact on many, many people across this region. So while people may not necessarily be supportive of the regime of Iran and what it does. From a religious perspective, he is a figure that is revered, that is respected, and if he has been killed, it will have an impact across this region. And many people, Shia and Sunni Muslims, will be highly uneasy, to say the least, about a military operation taking place during Ramadan. So while the US tries to win friends in the region, it's also going to run up against opposition, certainly from large parts of the Middle East.
All right, Ian, panel for us, thank you. We are just now getting a statement from a senior Israeli official to ABC News. I'm going to read part of this for you, saying 2 days after suffering the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, Prime Minister Netanyahu told the people of Israel that we need patience, but we will change the map of the Middle East. That is what we did by hitting our enemies on 7 fronts in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and he goes on there. But he also says today President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu began to change the world. I want to go back to our Chief Global Affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, to just get your take on that, because it's significant that Israeli officials are talking about changing the map, changing the world, as President Trump and the administration are talking about regime change. What does this all mean for the Middle East and U.S. involvement in the days ahead?
Well, I certainly think one thing that everybody has to look at, and in many ways, President Trump wants to do the same thing. They want regime change. That would change the Middle East. That would change the world. The problem is we don't know who would take over. Benjamin Netanyahu also said this bombing campaign will go on until the terrorist threat is eliminated. President Trump has said he wants the nuclear weapons program killed completely, wants to annihilate the Navy, and he wants the regime change. Now, I think one of the things that we're really watching closely is whether or not the Ayatollah was killed and the president of Iran were killed. The Israelis have exquisite intelligence. They likely knew exactly where the Ayatollah was and where the president was. We know that their compounds in the area were bombed. We have seen imagery from that. The Airbus imagery that the New York Times was able to get showed the Ayatollah's compound with lots of rubble inside of that. Normally, I think he would not be there overnight. They are probably moving around, given the threat. But because this came in the daytime, and it has really never happened before that you have a daytime strike like that, it is possible. But the big question is what is next. You can see that compound there and the smoke rising from there, and that is a big hole in that compound. So if he was even nearby, it's possible he was injured. The Iranians, of course, say that's not true. We'll have to wait and see about that. Are they trying to wipe out the senior leadership? All of this would change the map of the Middle East, depending on what happens next, depending on the success of this. You can't just say to a population, lay down your arms. We've seen thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of protesters hitting the street who want change, those opposition leaders. But I have been there enough to know there are millions and millions of hardliners in that country that do not want change. And will there be clashes between those two factions? That is also something to watch. But I know that the Israelis have had great success with their intelligence in the past. I mentioned earlier that I have been there when the Iranians are showing the cars that got blown up by the Israelis of nuclear scientists. Those cars, they put explosive on the very side of those cars. This was a display they had of the cars. You can see that the cars themselves are not that damaged, and yet they were able to kill numerous nuclear scientists. We also saw in 2024, after the October 7th attack, that the Israelis managed to kill a Hamas leader. And that Hamas leader was staying in a guest house in Tehran, and they had planted explosives months before. The Israelis, they waited till he got there. They sent in a tiny drone to make sure it was the Hamas leader. And once they did that, they remotely controlled a bomb and killed him. So those are the kinds of things the Israelis have been able to do over the years. Whether they were successful in trying to target and take out the regime, we'll have to see. But that is key to what happens here, key to how this ends.
And Martha, just to emphasize the significance of all of this, too, you talked about the Israelis, but also the Americans. I mean, Nicolas Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, is just over the river in Brooklyn right now in jail. Taken out, extracted by the U.S. military. Just the shift in strategy to the significance of if we actually targeted and took out the Ayatollah and president of Iran, the ramifications and the implications of what this really could mean.
This was, first of all, let's go back to Venezuela for a second. That was an extraordinary mission, and for President Trump, a very successful mission. But there were about 100 people killed in order to go in and get Maduro. This one is far riskier. Certainly our forces took great risk in that Venezuela operation. We saw at the State of the Union that very courageous pilot who was shot and still managed to get his helicopter in and out of there. But this mission, given the fact that Iran has thousands and thousands of missiles and that their military is far, far, far more powerful and what the Iranians have than the Venezuelans. So these are very different. But you have seen President Trump use the military. You saw last summer, of course, going after the nuclear program, Venezuela. This is different. This is very different. We have to see what the end game is.
Yeah, we've heard Prime Minister Netanyahu talk about peace through strength, especially when he's with President Trump. They're showing their strength here. The question is, can peace come and how quickly after what we've seen today? Martha Raddatz for us. We appreciate it. Let's bring in retired Lieutenant General Doug Lute, former U.S.